Good afternoon, Vuyo. How are you doing today? Hi, Vuyo. Can you hear me?
Hi, Nyasha. I can hear you. Yes.
Okay. I wanted to find out, did you hear my introduction?
No, I didn't.
Okay. Okay. So I wanted to find out, how are you doing? Where are you based?
Thanks, Nyasha. So I'm based in Pretoria. I work for an international development agency where I manage a number of development programs in the region. Our programs are focused on agriculture development, business enablement, skills development, and capacity building in a number of countries in the region. Yeah, thanks. And I'm also
Okay.
a development studies student.
Okay, so our topic today is, we're discussing development in Africa and the state of development amidst a pandemic. I mean, we need to make commemoration to World AIDS Day. That was yesterday, the 1st of December. And we're not new to pandemics, but want to focus on how has COVID-19 added onto the array of problems and slowed down development per se on the continent.
Thanks, Nyasha. So the ongoing impact of the global COVID-19 pandemic has been felt across sub-Saharan African countries and Africa as a whole. The inequalities have not only been highlighted by the pandemic, but they've also been aggravated by the response implemented by African governments in trying to tackle their health crisis caused by COVID. So COVID has caused a health and socioeconomic crisis for a number of African countries, which will be felt for a much longer time than in other parts of the world. However, although the health crisis is significant, COVID-19 has caused more of an economic crisis than it has a loss of lives in the region. And in terms of post-COVID economic recovery, the income gap between Africa and the rest of the world is most likely to widen. The IMF had projected a 3.4% regional economic growth for 2021. So post-COVID economic recovery on the continent is most likely to trail behind the rest of the world. GDP growth was forecasted at 3.6% for Africa between 2020 and 2025, which is slightly lower than what the 6% that was forecasted by the IMF for the rest of the world. So economic recovery will be a challenge for most of the African countries, and it's probably the biggest challenge that the continent will face. But COVID-19 has also had a negative impact on the informal economy. Livelihoods, food security, and the labor market was significantly impacted by the pandemic. The informal economy is considered a hidden part of the economy for most high-income countries, but for the continent, it accounts for almost 90% of employment for least developed countries. And we know that women are the largest proportion of the labor participation rate in the informal sector. So they have faced either a significant loss in their income or significant decline rather, or complete loss in their personal income. And this has widened the gender poverty gap. And we also know that informal sector workers often are exposed to poor safety and health conditions, and they're not in possession of health insurance or in the position to access quality health care. So what the pandemic has done is that it has made vulnerable people in an even more vulnerable, has left them in an even more vulnerable situation than they were prior to COVID-19. We've seen how the development gains achieved over the past 20 years by a number of countries on the continent have almost been wiped out by this pandemic. The inequalities have also been intensified at a community, national, and international level. And the loss in personal income has led to greater food insecurity, has pushed a number of people further into poverty. And because of this, it'll be quite difficult for a number of countries on the continent to bolster economic development. The pandemic has also caused a risk to the attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly the global goal to end poverty by 2030. The population in the sub-Saharan region is already living beyond the poverty line. So coupled with the challenges faced by countries on the continent, like conflict as seen in Tigray and Cabo Delgado, the countries are still facing climate change impacts, which have had an effect on agricultural development. We've seen how countries are still battling malaria and Ebola, as well as the HIV/AIDS scourge. So the widening income gap has really left countries in a position where the standard of living will definitely decrease, and it will be harder for countries to foster socioeconomic recovery and get onto an upward trajectory towards the kind of development that is needed to improve the standard of living for all populations. This topic is quite huge because there's so many challenges that African countries have faced, but just to summarize it and keep it short, I'll mention that we have seen a rise in crime, so sporadic social unrest in different parts of the continent, as well as what has been termed the shadow pandemic, which is gender-based violence. And with the social unrest experienced in countries like Eswatini and the looting that took place in South Africa in July, there are a number of causes for these events, but we can't deny the fact that the high unemployment rates, as well as a lack of opportunities to secure livelihoods, is one of the reasons why citizens resorted to protesting to voice their frustrations, as well as looting in really bad cases in order to just sustain themselves. So yeah, in essence, these are the biggest challenges that have been faced by a number of countries since the start of the pandemic. And of course, the accumulating public debt, which is affecting a number of budgets. For example, a number of countries have started cutting on social protection budgets, which disproportionately impact women and girls. So you see how Eritrea, for example, cut down on its education budget, and so many other countries cut down on social welfare, which affects the most vulnerable in our population, which are women and girls. So I think the number of people who have, the population that has been affected the most by this pandemic have been women and girls, unfortunately. They've been left in a position where they aren't able to make decisions to improve their lives, because we've seen a number of children drop out of school since the start of the global lockdown in March 2020. We've seen an increase in teenage pregnancy rates in countries like Kenya and South Africa, and all these factors will push children further into poverty. COVID-19 has impacted their education, their safety, their protection, and health and nutrition. So in terms of the youth being our greatest resource and being a tool for accelerating development in the region, these issues are really worrying. Thanks, Nasha.
Thank you so much. I'm going to add on Mr. Tajichka. Jeremiah Musungo, thank you very much for joining us. Jeremiah is the CEO of Nature's Cabin. He's based in Zimbabwe. He single-handedly started these companies. He'll give us a brief introduction about what he does and his amazing products and what he's doing here in South Africa. Mr. Musungo, I really admire your resilience during this time, and everything that you're doing is very exciting. Obviously, today you're joining us to tell us some of the challenges that a businessman like you in Zimbabwe faces. And I have a few questions of my own because you're on the ground and you could explain. So in your introduction, Mr. Musungo, please may you just let me know what challenges you are facing in your home country, Zimbabwe, since this pandemic, which was late 2018 December, up to 2021 December?
Thank you, Nyasha, for the invitation to be part of this panel, this discussion. It's such an honor and a privilege. First of all, I want to say that I did not single-handedly start the business that we ran. Have a partner who is our formulator. So whatever we've done is result of group team efforts. And then to just to dive into your questions, I want to say that COVID has had a very negative impact on small businesses such as ours or startups, because we have seen incomes eroded. So when incomes are being eroded, it means customers don't have the buying power which they used to have. So we've seen that we've had to work twice as hard to make the revenue that we're making in 2018, 2019. But the good thing is it's also forcing us to be innovative and also to pivot to digital. But that being said, it's not easy for a lot of people. So I've seen a lot of businesses that were started by excited entrepreneurs fold. So we've seen when those businesses close shop, jobs are lost, and a lot of livelihoods are also affected in a bad way.
Thank you very much. And last but not least, I'm going to add to our stream Mr. Frank Mukholobodo. How are you, Frank?
Hi, Nyasha. How are you?
Good afternoon, Frank.
Good afternoon, Nyasha. Am I audible?
You are audible.
And can you all see me?
We can all see you, Frank. How are you
Awesome.
doing?
Good. How are you, Nyasha?
I'm very well, thanks. So, Frank,
good afternoon to the fellow panelists as well, and everyone who's tuned in. Thank you for having me on the panel, Nyasha.
It's a pleasure, Frank. Frank, so I would like you to just give a brief introduction to yourself, what you're doing, and please connect it to our topic today, how in IT and digitization, how have you been impacted by COVID-19 and, in development on the continent?
Okay. So just by way of introduction, I'm Frank Mukholobotu, and I'm the managing director of a company called Mdiba Technologies. And by profession, I'm an IT management consultant specializing in digital transformation. How COVID-19, the pandemic, as well as the lockdown that was a consequence of the pandemic, affected us as a business. It was a gift and a curse. It forced us to be a bit more innovative, a bit more creative in the way we do business, and kind of accelerated the digital transformation process, accelerated some of our clients embracing technology because we really had no option but to work on various platforms. And it was a curse, or the negative side, in that some of our services that we provide, so especially in the space of consulting, was shelved because it wasn't a priority at the time. All the businesses were sort of resorting to their core businesses and to what keeps them alive. So everyone went into survival mode, and the nice to haves were kind of put on the back foot. So we got a bit of both the positives and the negatives from the pandemic.
Okay, thank you, Frank. I'm going to go back to Vuyokazi. With something that you said in your introduction, and you were talking about the pandemic increasing the gap between the marginalized, and by marginalized, I'm making reference to the youth, the child in the rural areas, the ones that do not have access to running water, they do not have electricity. How has this pandemic actually done that? How has it increased the... Okay, can you hear me now, Vuyo?
Our connection's been bad. I didn't get your question. I can hear you now.
Okay, Frank, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so what I'm going to come back to you, Vuyokazi, because the question also overlaps with IT and digitization.
Are you still there,
I was speaking about how the gap in the economic gap has increased between the marginalized, the haves and the have-nots. So with digitization, I would assume that, if this has happened, it means that people do not have access to water, electricity, telecom access. How will digitization, how will it get to them? How do they get that access?
I think the answer there, Nyasha, lies in a policy discussion. For us to legislate access to data or bandwidth in the same way that we do access to basic services such as water. I think the way that the world has evolved, it's simply putting us in a position where access to the internet and access to bandwidth is a basic human right. Myself, in my capacity as a digital transformation ambassador, I always fight for digital inclusion. We saw that divide that you're referring to a lot with the schools and their various curriculums and the various schooling programs, where schools in the rural areas and government schools lagged behind the private schools because they couldn't continue doing their schooling from home. So this COVID might be with us for the foreseeable future. So, we have to move fast in order to ensure that there's digital inclusion. And I think that the way to get that right would be by means of a policy direction in the various portfolio committees that sit in Parliament. I think this has to be a hot topic, specifically around the Department of Communications. This has to be high on their agenda to ensure that it's a basic human right to grant access to the have-nots, because the divide will only get bigger and bigger. And with the youth unemployment rate that we have, it's a serious cause for concern. So, we are quite lagging and we're behind on that topic.
Okay, thank you, Frank. I will get back to Vuyo now. Vuyo? Can you hear me, Vuyo? Okay, Jerry, I have a question for you regarding small businesses, and you were speaking about what has been happening in Zimbabwe and that things are more difficult. Does Zimbabwe have social funds that have been given out to small businesses to try and keep them afloat during this pandemic?
Thank you for your question, Yasha. Zimbabwe has no social funds that have been given to small businesses, at least not that I'm aware of. I do follow the space of SMEs associations quite a lot. I'm sure if funds had been availed, I would have been made aware of it. What I know is that if you see a small business still standing in Zim, you need to respect that person, because there's a lot of bootstrapping, there's a lot of resourcefulness, sacrifices that are being made to just keep those businesses afloat. Yeah, I think the private sector probably has greater capacity than the Zimbabwean government in terms of being able to offer some packages to small businesses, because I think the big businesses also need the small businesses to, to keep the economy well, because the small businesses in Zim actually employ more people than the big businesses. So I think something could be done to mobilize funds for small businesses that are trying to stay afloat during this pandemic. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Jerry. Vuyo, I'm going to try and ask you a question again. I wanted to find out what assistance have African countries been given to help deal with this pandemic?
I didn't hear you.
Okay, so what I'm going to do for you, Vuyo, I am going to send her a message with the question, because I see that there's a bit of a delay, but eventually she gets the communication. So we will try that. I will type this message to her. Thank goodness for technology.
Thanks, Nyasha. Can you hear me? Okay, I'll just continue. So even prior to the global pandemic, we had already the international development landscape. A number of countries started to play a more prominent role in providing cooperation and development assistance to countries in the global south. For example, you had southern powers like India, China, Brazil, and even South Africa beginning to provide more development assistance to countries in the global south. However, just to answer your question, a number of African countries on the continent, countries on the continent receive financial assistance from international development institutions, as well as multilateral banks and bilateral donor countries in the West. But what COVID has done is that these emerging donors like India, Brazil, China, and South Africa, as well as the Western superpowers, were now faced with the health crisis and economic crisis of their own. So they found themselves in a position where they're unable to provide as much assistance as they would have liked. And this has caused a shift away from a traditional form of donor assistance, and we now see countries from the south provide financial and technical assistance to northern powers. We've also seen countries from the global south providing support to less developed countries. So there's a shift towards south to north cooperation, as well as south-south cooperation, which reflects a change in thinking, because instead of having least developed countries always relying on Western powers to provide financial and technical support, which is often viewed as being paternalistic, where a country simply comes to an African country, Western power comes to an African country and provides financial assistance for a development program and is very paternalistic in how the program is implemented. We've seen how African countries are more vocal in how they would like their development cooperation to be. And this has also created, this is enabled a rise in different modes of cooperation. We've seen how trilateral and bilateral cooperation has gained prominence in the development space, and which is actually all positive, because this, although we've also seen a fragmentation in the multilateral framework because of all these new actors that have joined the international development landscape, this has provided countries in the global south and countries that were considered developed a little over 20 years ago now have the opportunity to finally rise up and increase their influence and role in the global world order. So it'll be crucial in the 21st century that African countries develop their own mode of cooperation, and by implementing intercontinental trade and intracontinental cooperation, and the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is a step in that direction, as it will help these African countries bolster their socioeconomic recovery by deepening economic integration on the continent, establishing, or rather strengthening, regional value chain development, as well as industrial development, and supporting structural transformation and inclusive development. Africa as a continent has a number of resources, and with a growing youth population that currently accounts for more than 60% of its entire population, it will be imperative that African governments implement programs that are targeted at the youth, specifically skills development as well as education, as the youth will be a tool for building human capacity on the continent, as well as driving socioeconomic recovery.
Yasha, you on mute.
Thank you very much, Frank. Thank you very much, Frank. I was seeing myself move, and it seems like she's listening. She can hear me. What, in your view, is the current state of economic development?
Okay, so debt and development are intertwined challenges that will affect economic development on the continent for much longer than expected. We've seen a number of countries increase their public debt over the years prior to the pandemic, but what the pandemic has done is just exacerbated inequalities and resulted in countries having less and less of funds to focus on development while they try to service their debts. So the IMF had ranked a number of countries, Ethiopia are currently listed as at high risk of debt distress, and Zambia was long forecasted as being a country that is at high risk of debt distress, and was actually the first country to default on their debt payments since the start of the lockdown in March 2020. We also have countries that have been in debt distress for some time, such as Mozambique and Zimbabwe, and we've seen how difficult it has been for them to boost economic development and get on an upward trajectory again. So it's I think economic development on the continent will be very difficult, given that most countries are faced with escalating public debts to international creditors as well as domestic creditors in their countries. I also think this conversation can't end without me just touching on the role that China has played in debt accumulation on the continent. Around 20% of African government external debt is owed to China for infrastructure projects that focus on the building of roads, railways, and ports. And these are all things that will be important to boost socioeconomic development on the continent. However, as a southern power, this might cause problems for them, and especially for development cooperation in the future. China's biggest development program is the Belton Road Initiative, which is focused on infrastructure projects on the continent, and most countries on the continent are part of this initiative, and are also at high risk of defaulting on their debt payments. So this may have negative consequences for this initiative. I think it will face backlash from low and middle income countries. It's also interesting to note that China has in the past been open to debt cancellations and restructuring. And although they're quite hesitant to publicly declare or disclose their stance on debt relief, they have been advocating for special drawing rights for African countries that are experiencing high debt. And they're also they've signed agreements on debt suspension with 19 African countries. So it would be great if China could consider writing off interest-free loans to countries that are facing high risks of a debt burden, just to help them deal with the debt burdens and service their debts, as well as just grapple with the impacts of COVID-19. And it's also important to note that I know there's been so many comments about how China is contributing to debt accumulation and the debt trap in Africa. However, when you consider the long-term challenges that African economies are facing, and you consider the type of assistance that China has provided to African countries, you realize that it is quite crucial that China does increase its support to African countries, as their approach to development assistance on the continent is quite different to multilateral banks such as the World Bank and other donors, more prominent and powerful donors, in that the methodology that they use to assess loan is different. And it's easier and faster to have a loan approved by Chinese actors for these larger scale projects that focus on things, on projects that will boost economic recovery. So the Sustainable Development Goals can only be achieved through greater financial support, not just from China, but from other donors. And a new debt system would need to be established in order to help to create a debt system that doesn't just benefit the larger traditional creditors, but can actually help developing countries accelerate socioeconomic development in their contexts.
Very much. Thank you, Vuyo. I'm going to go back to Jerry. My question comes in two parts. I've been following, in this past week with this new variant, the Omicron virus, various with the COVID virus, and there'll be lots more variants to come, or that have come, or we keep track. And what impact does this have with the new restrictions that have been placed on travel in Zimbabwe? I know we have a large diasporian community, and it is part of what happens in December. Families come back. The economic injection that the diasporian community has on our economy, does it make a difference to small businesses, or the fact that a lot of people won't be going back home, there's no difference to your small business per se?
Thank you for that question. I think it's very unfortunate that the authorities reacted with panic and extreme measures. I think this is not the time to be making it difficult for Zimbabweans who want to go home, or even make it difficult for tourists who were planning to spend their December holiday in Zimbabwe to come to Zim, because the tourism industry in Zim desperately needs every dollar that it can get, because it was heavily affected by the lockdowns and the last travel bans. So I have a few friends in that industry. They definitely need as many tourists as possible. And then coming back to us as a small business, we might not necessarily get purchases from people who are coming from outside. But what happens is when diasporans come back home, they inject some money into the economy. So when the money is in the economy, it goes around and it ends up in the hands of our customers, who then come and purchase our products. So so if you appreciate the relatedness of everything, or the connectedness of things, you do appreciate that every business person can do with cash injection that we get from the diasporan community when it comes home for the holidays. So I'm just praying that the authorities will have a change of heart. Zimbabwe needs people to come home. Zimbabwe needs tourists. So I'm going to borrow what some experts have said. They've said that the travel bans stemming out of the discovery of this variant were more political than they were scientific. So I think there is no need to be shutting down, or at least to be making it difficult for people to come home because of the 14 days quarantine. I think they need to remove that quarantine, allow people to go wherever they want to go. Obviously, observing COVID protocols, which are still being observed in public places. For example, like if you pass through the Robert Mugabe International Airport right now, people accompanying travelers are no longer allowed inside. So there are already enough measures to enforce social distancing. I think they need to lift the quarantine measures, encourage people to come to Zim. Zim needs that tourism, and then the economy needs that money. We're small businesses. We need that money circulating in the economy, because when it's circulating in the economy, our customers also come and buy our products. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Jerry. I have a question for you, Frank. I wanted to find out what steps Africa has taken to catch up with the world at large technologically.
It's one of those questions that has, I've got my own views on Africa's efforts to catch up to the world, because all the efforts are in collaboration with the rest of the world. And there's no homegrown products that Africa is selling into the world. So what has happened with the West and maybe parts of the East is that we've created these incubation and innovation hubs in our economic hubs in the continent. So you've got hubs in East Africa. I know Kenya is the tech capital of that region. And you've got the likes of Nigeria in the West, and then you have South Africa down south. So we've done a lot of collaborations as a continent with the likes of Amazon Web Services, with the likes of Google, Microsoft, around, creating these incubators where we upskill local talent around emerging technologies such as cloud technologies, broadband and networking, software development, data analytics, artificial intelligence and machine learning. So it's difficult to say Africa is doing it, because it's being done under the banner of various governments around the world and private institutions that are broadly American, such as your Googles and Amazons. I know the British government is also it's also started these tech centers of excellence in those regions, in the West, East, and the South, where they're basically seeking innovative ideas to solve societal problems. And if you have such an idea and present a business case that is compelling enough for them, they will then fund your product or your development, and also offer facilities like office space and research and development facilities through their partnerships with some of the world's leading universities and also local universities such as WITS, etc. So academically, that now takes me to the next point. We've done quite well in our research and development. It's just that execution in terms of us getting the required amount of backing from our governments, I don't think it's sufficient. And I think for that reason, we're lagging behind. If you were to get deep into the kind of support and backing the leading global tech giants get from their governments, I mean, just to mention a few, Alibaba, which was the biggest e-commerce platform for a while. Another one is Amazon, Google. So, I mean, the American government would go to the extent of blocking a Chinese tech giant like Huawei to ensure that they advance their agenda as Americans. I think we also need to start being as unapologetic about backing our local technology innovations continentally. I mean, we've done work in Angola, we've done work in Namibia, in Kenya as well, etc. But, you know, for us to become global players, we need a bit more support from our governments.
Thank you very much, Frank. The next question, you were talking about, just for the man on the street, what do you mean by homegrown products in technology that we are selling? What did you mean by that? Please elaborate.
So basically locally manufactured, locally produced software and hardware. I'm sure, Nyasha, the computer you're using wasn't manufactured or assembled in Africa. The cell phone you use and the software that lives in that cell phone was not developed in Africa. The chips that are in these devices not developed in Africa, which the microchips is a big component of innovating. The broadband and network infrastructure not produced in Africa. The people that support all this tech, the bulk of the skills were developed outside of South Africa, or the institutions that offer those skills are either American or European or Asian. So that's what I mean, that from a skill set perspective, we need to locally produce because we know problems that are unique to us. So it will assist if we have the skill set to accelerate the resolution of those programs or problems rather than outsourcing the solutions. From a hardware point of view, we need to build industrialists that produce and manufacture. From a software point of view as well, industrialists that code software that belongs to us and where we can have the source code and innovate and pivot and update and change as and when required, because the world is ever evolving. So that's what I mean. So basically, if we have a problem, we have to go to Microsoft, or we must go to a giant like HP or an Amazon or a Google, which, it's good and well to collaborate, but we also need to hold our own within the space because, the appetite is there. It's just a matter of skills development and support.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Frank. And now I'm just going to, in closing, just ask each of you to just give me some final words regarding our topic today, and to just also let me know if you have other things to say regarding how we can continue amidst this pandemic. And thank you very much for your time. I will take one question from the guests that came in, and I will direct it to Vuyo just briefly, maybe a minute, Vuyo. Patrick Jamison says, China is buying the continent, just took over an airport in Africa. To African Americans, it appears that Africa is changing from one oppressor to another. White oppressors for Asian oppressors, taking African resources to foreign countries. Do you think there's any truth in this statement or question?
To African governments are contributing to the accumulation of debt. But like I said earlier, when you consider the longer-term challenges that are faced by African economies and consider how the Chinese government has been offering loans to African countries where multilateral development banks like the World Bank haven't or have had much stricter terms, the Chinese government and the loans that they provide to the African continent can boost development. And I totally share his sentiments to some extent, but the loans provided by the Chinese government have also been of benefit for a number of African countries. That is worrying, of course, but at the same time, the Belton Road Initiative has significantly helped a number of countries improve on their infrastructure, which will help with the African Continental Free Trade Agreement when it comes to establishing or strengthening regional value chain development on the continent. So it's a bit difficult to measure, but yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Vuyo. And another question for you, Jerry, to just let me know what you think about the situation getting aid and injection and debt into Zimbabwe, and where you think we are headed, with small businesses in the country.
Sorry. Are you talking about getting aid, which is targeted at helping small businesses, or aid which is targeted at the nation, just the nation in general?
Aid which is targeted at the nation, as well as, because I'll be, the aid will then be handed down to the small businesses. It's cash injected into the economy, into the country, and then the country budgets for different segments, whether it is in the health, in the businesses. How do you think, what is this? Is it a positive thing to be receiving, or should we as Africa learn to assist ourselves and find solutions within ourselves to, help us go forward?
Okay, thank you for the clarification. I think aid, if it comes with, or if it's humanitarian aid, it's okay. But I think we need more developmental aid than humanitarian aid, because humanitarian aid seems to be keeping us dependent on those who are giving us aid. But I think if we are to get developmental aid, I think we can increase our capacity to be able to, to sustain ourselves, to be able to, for the nations to become reasonably prosperous enough, to be able to take care of their own needs. So I think we need to, if we are to say in terms of what kind of aid we want, I would say we need developmental aid and FDI for the private sector. I actually think that going back to the subject which Vuyo has spoken a lot about, I think infrastructure could be built by private players in Africa, and that won't really, impact our national debt, because the infrastructure is built and it's owned and operated by the private players. If I look at some of the projects, especially if I look at the liquid fiber optic network from Cape Town to Cairo, from East to West Africa, built by private players, without adding debt to African economies which are failing to pay off that debt. I think the model, our development model as Africans needs to change. I think African governments should move away from wanting to own public infrastructure and allowing private players to own it. I mean, if you look at the US, I watched the documentary, The Man Who Built America, railroad, energy. A lot of these big industries which sustain the nation were built by private players without, piling debt onto the public. So I think our development model needs to change as Africans. We don't need to be getting our governments to be borrowing from China or borrowing from the West, because obviously those lenders are not wanting Africa to be prosperous and to be, because as long as Africa is dependent, it can be controlled. They have a say in terms of what we do with our resources. So I think Africa needs to shift away from asking for aid for infrastructure projects. Let the private sector do the infrastructure projects, because I personally believe that individuals in Africa have the money to actually do these projects. It's just that in most cases they are not given the space to do these projects, but given the space, they have the money, or they can actually they have the credibility to raise the money on capital markets in the global world. So I think the shift needs to change. And then, if I understood you well, we also need a smart model of funding small businesses or startups. I think we need to understand that small businesses are the future of the economy. If you give startups or entrepreneurs enough or adequate support, there's a high chance that they will succeed. And if they succeed, they lessen the employment burden upon the government. I always hear Africans asking governments to create employment. Governments don't really create employment. It's entrepreneurs who are supposed to create employment. But give us the capacity, give us the support so that we develop our capacity, so that we can create the employment. Then we can also pay quality taxes, so that you have enough money for service delivery. That's what I would say if I was speaking to African heads of government.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Very well said, Mr. Msungo. I see a theme that has been going through all the different fields, whether it is IT, entrepreneurship and small businesses and development, humanitarian cooperation, is that the policies and our leaders and the governments. So in closing, I want to, of course, I'll give Frank just a minute to say, to give us his closing statement. But Vuyo, thank you very much. Can you hear me? Okay, Vuyo, I won't give her any more time. But Frank, could you please give us your closing statement? And thank you very much to everyone for for tuning in into this episode of the Pan-African Leadership Center. I hope you found it as informative as I did. I definitely learned a lot, and I'm leaving with some inspiration and a little more positive during this time. Thank you very much. Frank, over to you.
Thank you, Nyansha. So in closing, I don't know if we have any leaders in our audience, but I hope the message gets across. I think just to speak to Jerry's point, our leaders need to show a little bit more courage, a little bit more boldness in some of the positions and the postures they take with regards to intergovernmental and intragovernmental collaboration. I think they have to ensure that whatever agreements and mutual understanding, mutual memorandum of understandings that they get into with other countries are also to our benefit. Because I mean, amongst us as citizens and business people, the appetite is there. And with the right support, we can scale at the right level. I think the problem is Africa is not selling. Africa is doing a lot of exporting and buying. So we need to get to a point where we are selling processed manufactured goods, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's tech, whether it's vehicles, whether it's textile, whatever the case is. That's what will make us a global player in the greater scheme of things. So in closing, that's what I would like to implore to our leaders, that a little bit more courage and bravery in some of the policy development that serves the interest of Africans would be very helpful to us.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your time, Frank. Wish you all the best and all the success during this time, and hope your family are safe. And thank you very much to all the guests and all of you that tuned in. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Nasha. Thank you for having me. Bye.
Thank you.